name is Rachel Aldridge, Communications Project Manager at CRP, and I will be guiding you through the next 45 minutes of presentations and discussion. So big welcome to everyone on the call. This session is being recorded and will be available to view online afterwards as well. But if you do have any tech difficulties, please make sure you've joined us via Google Chrome. But yeah, any problems at all, please try logging in and then rejoining. So hopefully that should work. So during today's session, we will be joined by some experts working in the field. We have Lauren Rackhusen from Bloomberg Associates, who will be presenting on how to follow data in terms of climate risk mapping in London. Ben Connor, GLA, will be presenting on climate adaptation and green infrastructure. Fiona Coull from CRP will be speaking about our latest greening guidance as part of Healthy Streets Every Day. And we also have Isadora from CRP facilitating the chat function throughout the session. So during the session today, we will cover all of these topics on this slide, and I'll walk you through these. If you have anything that you'd like to ask our speakers, as we hear from them, then please type them into the chat box with your name and organisation. And if we don't have enough time, we will respond to everything via a detailed follow-up tomorrow. So firstly, just quickly, I'd like to introduce CRP over the next few slides. CRP was formed 27 years ago, and its vision is to empower people to deliver innovative projects that support places to respond well to the significant challenges that our city faces. CRP is delivering a wide range of projects, and we're extremely grateful to our partners and funders for making this possible. The Mayor of London's Air Quality Fund is one of our major funders, and also Central Government Department DEFRA is another one of our major funders, supporting CRP's Clean Air Villages programme. But Healthy Streets Every Day is a programme that will be detailed in this particular session. CRP is delivering London's future together with partners including local authorities, business improvement districts, communities, as you can see on screen. So in order to inspire us on the topic of climate risk mapping and addressing climate vulnerability, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Lauren from Bloomberg Associates. So over to you, Lauren.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Rackhusen from Bloomberg Associates, and today I'm very excited to share how we have used data to better understand London's climate risk through mapping and how strategic design interventions can help to reduce those risks. Now, advance this slide. All right, great. So for those of you who don't know, Bloomberg Associates was started by Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, to advise city governments around the world. And BA has a number of different disciplines, including urban planning, media and technology, economic development, and so on. Today, I'm highlighting some of the work of BA's sustainability team led by Adam Freed. We're working around the world in the pictured cities, and as you can see, London is one of our ongoing clients, and we've been working in London with the GLA, and climate adaptation has been a focus of our work together. So it's impossible to ignore that London is facing more severe and more frequent climate events with wide-ranging impacts, and these are just a few recent headlines that I grabbed from last week. In fact, climate risk mapping that we produced, and I will detail shortly, was referenced in a number of these recent articles, including The Guardian and Telegraph. Our analysis revealed that almost half of London's hospitals, 1 in 5 schools, and a quarter of the city's rail stations are at risk of flooding. Additionally, London's most vulnerable citizens tend to bear the brunt of climate impacts, which was also highlighted through our mapping. Recognizing this increasing and imminent challenge to help the GLA target its resources to communities with the highest climate risks, we worked to produce a series of citywide maps overlaying key metrics to identify areas within London that are most exposed to climate impacts with high concentrations of vulnerable populations. At the heart of this work is the ambition to help the GLA and other organizations, such as yourselves, to prioritize initiatives that aim to more effectively address climate risks, particularly flood and heat risk, as they relate to vulnerable groups. And before I go any further, I hope my colleagues on the line. I want to recognize my colleague, Andrea Partinio, who hopefully is here by now. She's a critical part of the team to help us produce the maps. And as you'll see, they're not only gorgeous maps, but contain valuable information. Working with the GLA, we identified the pictured short list of metrics to use within our mapping. These metrics were informed by a desire to map and visualize exposure and vulnerability metrics felt at the neighborhood level. They're informed by conversations with the GLA and their internal data sets, materials on the Climate Just website, several other academic and city programs to measure climate vulnerability, a number of workshops, which may have included some of you on the line, and looking at what other cities have done. Additionally, we measured it based on the availability of current data at a local level. This research and a desire to yield a target analysis led to the prioritization of the metrics that you see. Our working assumption has been to develop the most up-to-date granular target analysis to inform interventions at the borough level. Based on GLA's current work using the hex grid geography, we converted metrics when not already in hex to hex. We see these as ultimately being a dynamic living set of maps that can be adjusted based on desired output and goals for analysis. To better visualize and analyze the discrete metrics, we created overlay maps by adding layers of metrics together. We then developed 3 overlay maps: a general risk overlay map, a heat overlay map, and flooding overlay map. So first, we're looking at our overlay climate risk map, which overlays 11 of the 12 metrics that I first identified. As you can see based on this map, you can easily identify clusters and patterns using the hex grid. You can see clusters of high-risk areas towards the city center, as well as along water bodies with lower risk areas towards the periphery of the city. Next, we have our flood risk overlay map, which across London, which uses 8 of the 12 metrics. Again, you can see high-risk areas clustered towards the city center with somewhat greater intensity than the last map. And finally, we have our heat risk map, which uses 10 of the 12 metrics. Again, the highest area, and this is of course no surprise, highest areas of heat risk tend to be towards the built-up hardscape city center, but areas of intensity also vary from the last map. So let's see it in action. Now, I hope that once I conclude that all of you will go to the website that you can see at the bottom of the page and bookmark it to use and reference within your own work. But if we zoom into the Cross River Partnership's address, which is 64 Victoria Street, you can see, and this is a screenshot from the website, and you can see that I just isolated the overall climate risk map. And based on this mapping, you can see that the Cross River Partnership is in an area of high climate risk. And now if we just isolate the flood risk on the left and then heat risk on the right, you can see that it's an area within less flood risk as compared to heat risk. So just looking at this example, you can see that it's important to prioritize more urgently heat risk mitigation as compared to flooding. So what does all this mean? What's next? The GLA is using these maps to target investments as part of its green recovery to inform, as well as to inform grant recoveries such as the Future Neighborhoods Application Program, and as part of a Greener Together pilot. And I know Ben will discuss even more applications when he presents. And hopefully that is just the beginning of its work with these maps. And frankly, I'm really delighted to be discussing these maps with you all because the maps are only as good as they are useful. Our hope is they don't just sit in the data store website, but that they can help you all as you prioritize, budget, advocate for, and design interventions in your own neighborhoods and communities. So to give you some inspiration about how these maps can be used, I want to take you to Milan, one of our client cities, where we also produced a series of heat risk maps, and one of which is pictured here. And I want to show you how they're leveraging these heat maps within their work. So as part of that work using the heat maps, we're prioritizing tree planting and greening within social housing sites in Milan. And as part of which, we're targeting the city's most vulnerable and the hottest areas of the city to begin this work. And so you can see identified here are really hot areas where there's social housing sites that we want to begin our work and that we've started to prioritize it. And not only are we greening these areas, but we're taking open space improvements within communal areas of the social housing sites to renovate them. So we're creating new seating, tables, benches, shade, play equipment, so to foster a sense of community as well as to give people a place outside of their apartments to utilize. So you can see on the left an inaugural tree planting at a social housing site within Milan. But really, our heat maps have guided work in Milan in more ways than we could have anticipated when we first started. We're using the heat maps to inform greening and tree planting throughout the city, to plant trees in areas beyond parks, especially in gray and permeable areas like sidewalks. And to start that work, it required us to change regulations in the city's internal reporting structure to really be able to maximize the amount of tree planting that we can do within these green areas. And then this ultimately led us to incorporate within the city's master plan, or their PGT as they call it, tree planting and greening as a cornerstone of Milan's vision for the future of the city. And that's to say the mayor and the city of Milan have completely embraced tree planting as a result and launched a regional campaign to plant 3 million trees throughout the region. And they call this Foresta Me, this project. And pictured on the right is a project that we're calling Punte Verde, where we're depaving concrete areas, such as the pictured median, and greening them with plantings. So this is, you can see, just little plantings that were just planted, and so eventually they'll grow and become much more verdant. And we're also launching a project to plant trees and greening alongside highway corridors within the city. So using these heat risk maps enables you to drive data-led interventions to help strategically direct finite resources to those who are most impacted, especially those who are most vulnerable to heat and flooding risks. So I'm delighted to answer questions and would be even more delighted to speak to any of you in more detail about this work and how you might apply it in your borough. And I can also share my email in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to me offline, and as you start to look through the maps, reach out with any questions.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for a really interesting presentation. Yes, definitely please post any questions in the chat. I do have some pre-asked questions from the audience, so it'd be good to hear your answers to them. Firstly, if I could ask you, what are the most crucial steps that you think local authorities identified as high risk can take to mitigating the effects of climate change in their boroughs?
So thanks. That's a great starting question. So first of all, it's know your risk. So use, as I showed you, that website. Go onto it. Understand, are you in an area of high heat risk, flood risk? Is it both? So that when you start to plan your capital infrastructure programming, you can start to take into consideration those risks and build them into whatever your planning might be, and start to think about co-benefits as part of your infrastructure plan. And so part of what we've seen is if you're tearing up the sidewalk, if you're already breaking ground doing something, you might as well add some sort of mitigation measures to it. So it's really important to incorporate that within your planning. But it's also not only you yourselves knowing what those risks are, but advocating them to and explaining them to your community. So whether it's your board, your local stakeholders, helping them understand those heat risks is really important as part of just a general education, because a lot of people think, oh, the city's getting warmer at large, but they don't really understand how that relates to their specific community, and that there are discrete steps that can be taken, and also why the work that you're doing is helping to hopefully mitigate those.
Fantastic, thank you. We've also had a question from Craig. What are the typical heat risk interventions you have used?
So that's another great question, Craig. And it really varies. You know, one thing that we've learned is you can't take, and I'm based in New York City, you can't take what New York City did well and say, oh, well, this is a good fit for London, because it's not really a one size fits all solution, especially if you want to scale it. But that being said, there's a lot of, really basic things that you can do. Greening is a really easy one. And then that goes, even with greening, thinking about trees that make sense in New York City, of course, don't make sense necessarily in all parts of London. And as part of that, making sure that you can maintain whatever it is that you're doing. So obviously you don't want to have an extensive capital plan just to do the infrastructure and to build it, and then not have some sort of maintenance and operation plan alongside of it. So all considerations to have. But, greening is really important. Shading, wherever you can make impermeable surfaces permeable is really important. And not necessarily knowing your community and just spitballing some ideas. Water features are always great. They're a little bit more expensive. But, planting people is a great way to get community involved. And also seating, depending. I mean, and again, you all know, and I think that's really the advantage of speaking to you all, is you all know your communities. Is it a community that has senior citizens? In which case, having seating is really, really important, because people to encourage senior citizens to go outside and elderly populations, you have to have seating, because studies that we've seen, they don't like to necessarily take long walks if they don't know where they can sit. Similarly, water fountains are really important to be able to have stations for people to hydrate. So there's just a few, but Craig, I'd be happy, to discuss in more detail your specific community, rather than just giving you oblique ideas as to certain interventions that you could have.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'll just do a couple more questions. Someone's asked in the chat about trees. Does it kind of cause a security risk if you're planting lots of trees kind of within the street space?
So, it's funny because there's a lot of misnomers, let's say, about trees. One is security risk. Another is, retail sometimes gets a little nervous thinking, oh, wait, it's going to obscure my sign and therefore people won't know that I'm here. And studies that we've done have actually shown, and studies at large really have shown that trees help to activate streets, in the sense that a pedestrian, if they see two streets, they see one that's tree lined and one that's not, they'll choose the tree lined street in general to walk through. And therefore, to answer your question about security, it activates the street in the sense that there's more people, more eyes on the street. Obviously, security, depending on your concern, you can choose different trees with different canopy covers. So maybe you want a more porous canopy cover where it's not as dense or lower to the ground. Obviously, pruning is really important to make sure that the tree doesn't obscure lighting, so that at night you can still continue to have light penetrate through the tree canopy. And that also, pruning is also very important as it comes to retail, to make sure that obviously retail signage isn't obscured. But just to go back to the original point around studies and say that as a result of this increased pedestrian traffic, we've also seen property values go up where trees are planted, and retail actually be more successful on tree-lined streets.
Thank you, Lauren. And I'll just have one more question from the audience from Cyril. Is there a schedule for cost projections for interventions?
So because I speak American, schedule means a project plan. Is that right? Or schedule in terms of timing?
I think kind of a plan for...
Here's where the English and the, adaptation across the pond of English doesn't always translate.
I believe Cyril kind of wants to just know a bit more about the costing for these interventions. I don't know if that's something you could answer.
Yeah, so it really depends, and it also depends on kind of where, obviously, you're doing the interventions. Typically, it depends. You could do a 50-50 split in terms of if it's public-private partnership. Sponsorship is really, I think, increasingly a way that people are funding some of these interventions, in the sense that, there's a way to kind of label trees with a little badge that says this tree was brought to you by Bloomberg. And it's in front of Bloomberg headquarters, not to say that that's the only way, but also, benches and shading elements can be branded as well, sponsored opportunities. So, I know that this is a bleak way of answering it, but just to say that there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of grant funding. I know the GLA now is offering more pilot programs and grant funding around certain opportunities, and especially depending on what your infrastructure is looking to do. But it can really run the gamut in terms of even just, small plantings, taking out some impermeable surfaces can help, but also to say there's painting as well, where there's paint that you can paint on certain surfaces that lowers the temperature. And so that's a lower cost intervention when you obviously can't entirely change the streetscape and make it less hardscape, but you can put on this painting treatment as well. So, it runs the gamut, but I would say it's a great opportunity to start bringing in your businesses as part of that sponsorship, and to really foster a sense of community within your neighborhood as part of this work.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lauren, for your presentation. Those really in-depth answers as well. Perfect. I'd now like to introduce our next Lunchtime launch speaker, Ben Connor from the GLA. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks a lot, Rachel, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. So my name is Ben Connor. I work in the Green Infrastructure team within the Environment Unit at the GLA. So I'm going to talk a bit about the role of green infrastructure in climate adaptation, and how we're approaching this at City Hall. I'll give a bit of detail about the policy context for this work and our approach to greening London, talk about some of the tools that we have in place in terms of policy and guidance, and finally talk about some of our funding and some examples of projects we've supported. So picking up a bit on that last item of conversation. I think before I start, I think it's important to stress that whilst green infrastructure has a really important role to play in climate adaptation, it's definitely not the entire solution, and there's lots of other work that we're doing on this as well. So firstly, why do we need to adapt? And really to echo what Lauren said, as this timeline shows, the impacts of climate change are being felt in London now. Even if we achieve zero emissions tomorrow, we would have several decades of inevitable warming baked in. And London's particularly vulnerable. Climate change will make flooding more frequent and more severe, will threaten our water resources, and it will increase heat risk as well. And as we've seen this summer, we aren't yet adequately prepared for these impacts. And we also know that the most disadvantaged Londoners will be most severely affected. However, we also know that London is a very green city by both global and national standards, and around 50% of London is green cover in some form. And that's primarily a legacy of strong protection historically, especially for those more formal green spaces. But we also know that this greenery is very unevenly distributed, and the pandemic has really brought that into sharp focus. We know that Black, Asian and minority ethnic Londoners and more deprived Londoners are less likely to have access to both public or private green space. And the green spaces that we have aren't necessarily designed to provide the functions and the benefits that we need in the context of a changing climate. So to address these two issues, we need a network of green infrastructure of both green and blue spaces that is designed and managed to deliver a range of benefits for all Londoners. And when we talk about green infrastructure, we don't just mean the traditional parks and nature reserves that are at the core of that network, but also rivers, canals, blue spaces, and the green elements of the built environment. So street trees, green roofs, living walls, and sustainable drainage features that collectively have a key role to play as a critical infrastructure for the city to help us adapt to climate change. And we know that the benefits of green infrastructure include mitigating flooding, cooling the urban environment and providing shade, improving air and water quality, promoting active travel, supporting wildlife and biodiversity, and ultimately supporting Londoners' health and well-being. And we also know that these benefits are significant. So taking just one aspect of London's green infrastructure, its trees or its urban forest. The Valuing London's Urban Forest study a few years ago found that London's trees prevent 10 times the volume of the serpentine from entering the drainage system each year. They store over 2 million tonnes of carbon, and they remove over 2,000 tonnes of pollution from the air each year, which is equivalent to just over 10% of London's transport emissions. So London's green infrastructure provides us with a wealth of benefits, but in the context of climate change, we need it to do even more. So how are we approaching implementing this green infrastructure vision? I'm going to talk just briefly about three elements: about policy, about support and guidance, and about funding. So firstly, in terms of policy, the London Environment Strategy sets out some of our key ambitions and targets. So that includes for 50% of London to be green by 2050, so maintaining or increasing what we have now. And it also sets a target to increase tree canopy cover by 10% in the same time frame. And the London Plan, published this year, has strong policies on protecting existing green spaces, but it also requires boroughs to produce a green infrastructure strategy as part of their local plan, so introducing that strategic approach. And it also introduces a new urban greening factor policy that uses a scoring system to ensure that all major new developments include greening, with high quality greening providing multiple benefits, scoring more highly. We've actually just published a consultation version of some new guidance on that today. And then it's also about ensuring that green infrastructure is integrated into other policy areas. So for example, the Mayor's Transport Strategy sets targets for street trees and sustainable drainage, and also includes greener streets as a key element of the Healthy Streets approach. And I should say as well that tackling the climate and ecological emergency is at the heart of the plans for London's recovery from COVID-19, where the Green New Deal for London is one of 9 missions agreed by the London Recovery Board. So in supporting the delivery of this policy, we've produced a range of guidance and data to help both us at the GLA and other organisations deliver more green infrastructure where it is most needed. And And Lauren's already talked you through the climate risk mapping, which we're now starting to use and implement in our programs. One of the other tools that we've produced is a green infrastructure focus map. So this includes a range of social and environmental data, showing where there is both the greatest need for greening interventions and highlighting the key issues. So, for example, as you can see on the screen there, showing access to public open space, a particularly big issue there where our office is based. But it also highlights the type of interventions that you might want to prioritize. So is it interventions tackling air pollution, for example, or is it surface water flooding that's a particular issue? So these tools, and same with the climate risk map, it doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it helps to inform decisions and guide priorities. And we're using these data sets and others as well to inform our programs and prioritize projects for funding where they can deliver benefits where they are most needed. We've also published a series of guidance documents, and of particular relevance for today's session with the focus on climate adaptation are our sustainable drainage sector guidance, showing how SUDs can be implemented in a range of different contexts, from retail and commercial districts to schools and hospitals. We've also recently published guidance on other things, including running community depaving projects. So again, picking up on some of those examples from land that Lauren showed. And also a design guide to ensure that urban greening maximises the benefits for biodiversity. And then finally, we have various funding programmes to support projects helping to deliver on these green infrastructure objectives. So we have annual funding opportunities for community scale projects, previously through the Greener City Fund and now through our Grow Back Greener Fund. Applications for this year have recently closed. Hopefully some of you applied. And this time around, we were particularly pleased to have additional funding from Thames Water and to have climate adaptation and water as a specific theme within the programme. And the criteria of that Grow Back Greener Fund prioritises projects in locations that are of high climate risk and with poor access to green space. So I've just picked out a few examples of projects we've funded in recent years that are focused on some of those climate adaptation benefits. And the one you can see on the screen there is the depaving of the footway in Secker Street near Waterloo. And that was part of the Cornwall Road Greenway project led by We Are Waterloo. And it removed 100 square metres of hard surfacing, both reducing runoff and helping to promote this as a green walking route and involving community volunteers in the delivery. Another example is this small-scale sustainable drainage scheme that was partially funded by the Greener City Fund community grants, and this is up in Enfield. So integrating green infrastructure into the regeneration of the shopping precinct. So a widened pavement, seating, safe crossing, also providing that flood risk function. And this was also part of the London Strategic SUDS pilot study, which found that this type of small distributed sustainable drainage intervention has the potential to deliver both significant reductions in flood risk, but also even more benefits in terms of health and well-being, in terms of biodiversity and air quality, so those co-benefits. And it's not just the small schemes, we're also investing in larger strategic schemes as well. So expressions of interest are just about to close this afternoon, actually, for our new Green and Resilient Spaces programme, which is looking for large-scale projects transforming green spaces and greening the public realm that are specifically focused on those climate adaptation benefits. And again, we're using the data, the climate risk mapping, to prioritise locations for those projects and identify where need is greatest and where green infrastructure can have the most impact. And this builds on our previous Green Capital programme, which support projects like this one on the screen, which is again in Enfield at Albany Park, which here has the project released the Turkey Brook, the stream that you can see there, from a concrete channel into a more natural course, protecting hundreds of nearby properties from flooding, but also creating a landscape which is more biodiverse, but also more accessible and usable for people, as you can see in the picture there. And I'll finish there because I think it's a great example of how green infrastructure can help to tackle climate change whilst also delivering multiple co-benefits and ultimately supporting Londoners' well-being. And that's exactly the type of approach that we are looking to encourage from City Hall. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ben. Yes, I do have a pre-asked question from the audience. Just got about a minute for questions now. wondering if you could expand on the role of agriculture in green infrastructure and kind of supporting urban growing and sourcing food kind of grown using regenerative practices. I don't know if you have any comment on that, Ben.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think probably two things there. So I think one is certainly the role of small community-based food growing projects. Not only can they kind of deliver those benefits in terms of food, and are an important part of the green infrastructure network, but they're also a fantastic tool for engagement and participation from really kind of diverse communities. And through our community grants, the Greener City Fund and now the Grow Back Greener Fund, we supported lots of projects that kind of have food as that focus. I think it's a great way of engaging communities, particularly in green infrastructure projects, and using those spaces productively. So support some fantastic project last year in particular, which was working across several housing estates in Lambeth and looking at how that model of community food growing and participation could be rolled out further. And I think to add to that, the other opportunity around food growing is perhaps in those larger sites within London's green belt. So the mayor is very much committed to protecting the green belt, but also to improving the quality of those spaces as well. And I think thinking about how we can integrate sustainable food production into that alongside other uses, like increasing tree canopy cover and woodland creation in the green belt, is definitely something that we should be looking to do more of.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ben. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Fiona's presentation. Brilliant. Yes, Fiona will be speaking about urban greening. So over to you, Fiona.
Hi everyone, and thanks Rachel. As you said, my name's Fiona and I'm the Healthy Streets Everyday project manager here at CRP. And today I'm going to be giving a quick overview on our latest guidance document, Greening Out the Grey, the Value of Green Infrastructure for People and Places. But first, I thought it would be good to give a brief introduction to the Healthy Streets Everyday programme. So Healthy Streets Everyday is a 3-year Mayor's Air Quality funded programme, and we are currently halfway through the final year. We work with 16 borough partners, as well as landowners and business districts, to deliver lasting and transformative change to streets throughout London, helping to increase walking and cycling rates and also reduce exposure to air pollution. Creating streets that are pleasant, safe places for all Londoners to enjoy has become more important than ever. And as part of the programme, we deliver initiatives under 6 key work streams. Streetscape improvements, such as new cycle lanes, new traffic regulations to make streets more pedestrian friendly, for example, school streets, car-free behaviour through supporting initiatives like Clean Air Day and Car Free Day, providing guidance on how to create healthy streets, which we'll touch on in a moment, as well as supporting in terms of communications through educating people about air pollution, and finally, evaluation and monitoring of project interventions. So now that you know a little bit more about HSE, I wanted to give you a brief overview of our latest guidance document. So Greening Out the Grey, the Value of Green Infrastructure for People and Places, is a guidance document that aims to build the case for more green infrastructure to be implemented across the capital. It focuses on the benefits and costs of integrating green infrastructure as part of our cities and aims to demonstrate the value of using greening to improve air quality, enable climate adaptation, and also act as a tool to improve physical and mental well-being. We hope that this document will help to enable and encourage local authorities, planners and engineers involved in designing our cities to integrate greening far more widely as part of the planning process, helping to provide additional benefits to those who live, work and play in our cities. So I'll now go through the key themes of the guidance document in slightly more detail. So firstly, greening and air quality. Research indicates that over 9,000 Londoners die prematurely each year as a result of poor pollution, which impacts disproportionately, affecting more vulnerable groups such as young children. As a result, reducing exposure to air pollution is extremely important, and greening can help to do this through deposition and dispersion. For example, urban vegetation can greatly reduce the level of emissions people are exposed to by changing the speed and distance that pollutants travel before they reach people, effectively diluting the amount of pollution in the air. This process is known as dispersion. Additionally, urban vegetation can remove emissions from the air in their surroundings by a process called deposition. Here, pollution lands on the surface of a leaf, removing it from the air. The way that our streets are designed can often lend themselves to better dispersion and dispersal, with certain types of greening being more suited to certain streets and roads. Incorporating more greening into our streets to enable better dispersion and dispersal could ultimately have huge cost savings as well as benefits to people's health. For example, the Clean Air Fund commissioned a report by CBI Economics, which found that the UK economy could benefit to the tune of 1.6 billion each year if it were to achieve the guidelines set out by the World Health Organization for air quality. A link to this report will be put in the chat if you would like to learn a bit more. So another area that the guidance looks at is with regards to greening and heat resilience. London has experienced continually stronger heat waves over the last few years, and the climate of our city may look more like that of Barcelona's in 2050. This could cause problems for our infrastructure, with buildings and transport systems currently not designed to withstand high heat, and limited regulations are currently in place for cooling. However, a bigger focus is now being placed on London's resilience strategy, particularly on communicating cool spaces or centres. And the maps that Lauren and Ben have just described are brilliant tools to identify areas at climate risk. However, greening is an important tool to help reduce the impact of heat events. And although large green areas can have a significant impact on cooling a city, small-scale greening is also incredibly valuable, as Ben has highlighted. For example, research has shown that green roofs can improve ambient temperatures by up to 5 degrees Celsius at the roof level and 1.7 degrees Celsius at the pedestrian level by helping to cool and mix the surrounding air. Again, this could have huge cost implications, with one study estimating that the economic cost of fatalities from poor heat resilience could range from 323 million to 9.9 billion per year by the 2050s. Again, we'll put a link to the study in the chat. So another extremely topical section within the guidance relates to greening and flooding. We all saw the flooding that occurred this summer as a result from short, intense downpours of rain. And as we've already discussed, London is particularly vulnerable to flooding, with 15% of London sitting in the Thames floodplain. This is also not helped by the amount of paved surfaces that we have in London, making flash flooding even more probable. For example, in 2015, half of London's front gardens were paved over, and between 2005 and 2015, London saw the biggest decrease of plant cover in front gardens, with 5 times as many front gardens having no plants at all. However, plants play a vital role in reducing flood risk, and sustainable drainage systems, or SUDs, that we've already talked about, are a natural approach to managing drainage in and around properties and other developments. This is because leaves, branches, trunks all slow down the rain before it hits the ground, and therefore can spread the effect of a rainstorm over a longer period of time, allowing up to 30% of rainwater to evaporate back into the atmosphere directly from the canopy. As Ben mentioned, SUDs such as rain gardens have been used on both small and large scales across London, and there are some very good guides on how to implement and design these, such as those that we've already seen by the GLA. However, more of these measures are needed to help offset the current cost that flood damage costs the UK each year, which is approximately 1.3 billion. So finally, the last section of the guidance investigates greening and its impacts on mental health and well-being, a topic that again has become ever more important following the impact of COVID-19. In 2014, a study found that nearly half of UK adults think that they had a diagnosable mental health condition at some point in their life. And in 2009 to 10, the wider economic costs of mental illness in England were estimated at 105 billion each year, although more recently estimates have placed this at 94 billion. However, using greening through initiatives such as green social prescribing could help to reduce these costs by relieving pressure on the health and social care systems. Essentially, green social prescribing focuses on prescribing access to outdoor green areas to support individuals with their mental and physical health. And in fact, during Mental Health Awareness Week in 2021, or this year, a survey by the Mental Health Foundation found that 7 in 10 UK adults felt that being close to nature improves their mood, whilst 44% of adults said that being around nature helped them feel less worried and anxious. There is also evidence that exercising outdoors in natural and green spaces is more beneficial to health and well-being than indoor exercise, and even small green spaces are critical for reducing rates of some chronic diseases. For example, asthma rates in children are found to be lower when there is more tree cover. However, a major challenge for London will be providing access to green space whilst reducing green inequalities and climate gentrification. Green spaces are at a premium in London, and flats within 100 metres of a public green space are on average £2,500 more expensive than if they were more than 500 metres away. Additionally, fewer children in London regularly visit a park or green space than in any other part of England, and this is especially so for Black, Asian and minority ethnic children, as well as those from lower income households. However, as Ben touched on, the Mayor of London has ring-fenced £6 million of fresh investment in improving green spaces across London, particularly for those in the most disadvantaged areas of the capital, and this is a welcome source of funding to help towards closing the green spaces inequality gap. So now we've gone through the detail, the final section of the guidance provides some recommendations in order to incorporate greening more widely as part of our cities. As you can see, I've included the recommendations on screen, but they include elements such as providing more evidence on the impacts of incorporating greening, collaborating with different specialisms and sectors such as the health sector, integrating green infrastructure as part of climate adaptation strategies, particularly around heating and flooding, as well as generating more data on the impact of greening on mental health. So I hope you found that overview interesting, and I just wanted to note that CRP has worked on a number of guidance documents and projects that have focused on greening. And if you're keen to know more about this document or need any support with your own greening projects or funding applications, please do get in touch because we are more than happy to provide support. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. What brilliant insight and loads of information there. One question we've had pre-asked was, how can we get greening design into all development schemes right from the get-go concept stage?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, I think there's a need to emphasise the importance and value of integrating green infrastructure as part of the design practice. And I think that's partly why in our guidance document, we've called for more evidence on the impacts of greening solutions, such as rain gardens and green roofs. But I also think there's a need for councils to actively score development schemes that contain greening solutions more highly, or potentially set out requirements for a certain level of greening to be incorporated into all future developments. So for example, one way you could move toward this might be to set specific local targets in terms of green space, partially focusing on areas that lack access or have higher levels of deprivation, because I think having these in place could actually encourage designers, planners and local authority departments to think more about incorporating greening, and hopefully that would encourage it to be used more frequently as a solution to some of the problems we've talked about today.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess we have time for one more quick question. Would you mind giving some kind of examples or best practice case studies of greening initiatives from the Healthy Streets Everyday partners across London?
Yeah, sure. So one of the partners, the Cadogan Estates, they actually have done some greening and green roofs on some of the restaurants in their estates, which have been obviously really, as we've talked about, encouraging people to go and actually come to the area. That's been one kind of element where we've done things. Equally, we've installed quite a few parklets as part of the Healthy Streets Everyday programme. So for example, Hammersmith Bid has put in parklets, and again, this has been a really nice initiative. It's kind of tied in with things like their bringing bees back to the bid, and people have been really positive about them, and it provides kind of green spaces as well as kind of places to sit and rest, which we've already talked upon as being really important. So I'd say those are probably the main elements that we've incorporated greening, partly through things like green roofs and stuff like that, but also parklets, because they're a really good opportunity for more small space greening initiatives.
Brilliant, thank you, Fiona. Yeah, just a huge thank you to our three speakers, Lauren, Ben and Fiona today. I hope you found their presentations really useful and they provided you with further knowledge on greening and climate risk in London. I'd just like to point you to our next lunchtime launch session, the challenges and opportunities of fleet electrification, which will be at the end of October, and it will kind of detail CRP's FLES project. There's a link in the chat to sign up to that now. But yeah, any queries you do have, don't hesitate to get in contact with any one of us. Our contact details are on your screens now. So thank you again for some really great presentations, and thank you all for tuning in and participating. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.